As if driving this car wasn't unsafe enough, I created a list of everything wrong with the MG and why it shouldn't be on the roads. And so this Burnout Extra is going to be an in-depth video of me going over everything on this list and everything wrong with my MG. Just to start us off quick, it's pretty obvious, but there's no roof on the car. And I actually have the fabric part of the roof, but I don't have the metal part, the metal frame part of the top that goes with it. And so therefore, I just didn't install it. And so when it rains, I simply go under a tunnel. Like, simple as that. Like, I don't have a roof. I've been caught in the rain before. It will definitely happen again. Number two thing that's most obvious when you're driving it, specifically, is that there's no reverse. So every time I pull into a parking lot or pull into a driveway, I'm always parking on an incline so that I can either kick it in gear and put a block behind the tires, or I can just roll backwards with my foot on the clutch and then be able to drive away without ever using reverse. Another huge thing about this car is there's a missing bolt on the driver's fender. So down here, inside if you can look past all of the pollen that's in this car right now, there's actually a bolt that's supposed to be around here that goes through the cab. Now, the person before me drilled it at such an angle of a hole that I couldn't get a bolt straight through. It just went pretty much straight down to the chassis. So this right here wiggles. And on the highway, it wiggles a lot. And so on the highway driving this car, it's like this. And you can kind of hear it. And so if you stick your head out the side, you can notice there's fiberglass, you can see on my finger, there's fiberglass beginning to wear down the bottom. And yes, this fender shakes. Sometimes that headlight comes loose because the fender shakes so much. Now there's a couple things wrong with the rear end or the back end of the car. And that number one thing is there's no actual rear bumper. And when I tell you, I pass inspection, I've now passed inspection one time and I'll be going a second time, and there's no back bumper. There's not even something faking that there's a back bumper. So yes, right behind this bolt, there is a bracket, and that does protect the engine and does attach to the chassis and frame of the car, which is great for structural integrity and build of the car. However, there is no bumper piece, there is no bumper bracket, there is nothing that you hit before you hit the chassis and engine of the Volkswagen. So if I got rear-ended, you're pretty much going straight into the spare tire and a non-existent bumper. So that's a huge thing, is that there's no true back bumper to the car. Another thing that I definitely want to touch on while I'm back here is this tire. Not only is it a curb lover, however, it's not the same tire as the rest of the ones on the car. So if I break down, it's not even the right bolt pattern as the ones on the car. The ones on the car are Volkswagen rims, essentially, so they have 4 bolts in them, and this one has 5 bolt holes, that is, and it's not the right size width tire. So everything is wrong with this tire. However, it looks cool, and it's kind of funny that it's cut up by a curb, so I keep it on here anyways. And furthermore, these bolts that hold in the tire are actually loose. So I'm gonna lift up the tire right here. You can see that it kind of just wiggles around, and that quite literally is these bolts just not being tightened. And I actually think that the nut is tightened on as much as it can be, but there's no more thread left on the bolt on the other end, and that's why I can't tighten it more than it is. But regardless, I'm pretty sure those bolts hit the air filter anyways. But nonetheless, they are loose on the wrong rim, on the wrong tire, without a back bumper. I mentioned before, I don't even have reverse. However, if you slam the shifter to where reverse should be, you can actually get the reverse lights to come on as they should. However, these reverse lights I've installed, which are supposed to be white on most cars, your reverse lights are supposed to be white and a little bit brighter because they're white, essentially. And these are interior lights. These are just universal aftermarket interior rectangle lights that you can put in any car, that you can put in any trunk, any truck bed, whatever. My dad had them down his shop, and I was like, cool, that's gonna be my reverse lights. And so I installed them as low as possible so that you can barely see them. They are not bright, and they are not reverse lights, they're interior lights. Another thing is, I mentioned that when you have no reverse, I like to park on an incline. So that way you can just push the clutch in and then let the car roll back, and essentially there's your reverse. However, parking on an incline, sometimes I'll park overnight or something like that, and I'll throw a tarp over the cab part to make sure it doesn't get wet. However, when you park on an incline, the water actually seeps in down the sides of the fenders, and because it's a fiberglass body, it just runs along the body of the fiberglass and the metal chassis that's fully sealed, and essentially just collects water inside the cab of the MG. And so let me show you right here. This is inside the driver's seat underneath. Yes, I keep a fire extinguisher there in case it blows up, but this is all wet. You can see that there's essentially a puddle there. If you look right around my fingertips, you can see water is just collecting. And so this happens, and like I said, my hand is wet right now. That happens every time it rains, and it just collects underneath my seat. That's exactly where I keep my registration, fire extinguisher, and jumper cables. So yeah, it gets wet. Another thing right near the seats that's wrong with the MG, well, maybe not wrong, but definitely more ratchet than other cars, is that the hinge that both of the seats are on is actually a Home Depot hinge. I went to Home Depot and I bought one that was 11 inches long, just the cheapest hinge I could possibly find, and I threw it on the seats. And believe it or not, it's a very similar type hinge to this one back here by the trunk lid that lifts up. However, the Home Depot ones are much lower quality. And so like I said, there's 2 cheap hinges from Home Depot underneath both seats. So that's enough with the cab for right now. We're gonna head to the front of the car because there's way too much wrong with the cab that we'll come back to in a minute. So the front of the car is also just as wonky. Now, although it does have a front bumper, my front license plate is truly in fact held in by zip ties. And that's something that the inspection place did comment on. However, I looked at them and I said, there's no bracket that I can buy that could possibly hold the front bumper on this car. And so therefore, I just slapped it on with zip ties and they gave me a hard time, but it's whatever. Another issue with this car is the headlights, and there's multiple things wrong with it. First of all, they just aren't bright. And so you can't see that far in front of you. If a deer ran out about 100 yards in front of me, I just wouldn't be able to see it until I'm about 20 feet away. It's as simple as that. And they actually face the wrong direction. And so sometimes they'll face the lane over. So the person passing me, it looks like the lights are directly at them. However, it's just because I installed them the wrong way and they just don't face forward. Now going back to the brightness, I actually had to buy fog lights because the headlights weren't bright. And to put it in perspective, my fog lights that I bought aftermarket on Amazon are twice as bright as the original headlights that came with the MG kit. And on top of that, the fog lights are half cut off by the license plate. So when you turn the fog lights on, you're only getting about half of it from the top up. The rest is deflecting off the back of the front bumper. All of that is an issue, and none of it will be fixed because it does look cool, and I will continue to drive it like this. Now, if you're able to look past my dead headlights, then you can notice that both fenders are not cut correctly. And I actually used a jigsaw for these things, and I essentially just messed up on both fenders. And you can notice that right where my finger is, it's cut too big, and right here it's cut too big. Right here is kind of good. But you can notice that essentially both sides are not cut correctly. And that's a huge issue as far as water. Water just kind of seeps in. Do I care? No, not really. If you squint from 10 feet away, you won't even see them to begin with. But if you have the audacity to come up here and look at my car in detail, you'll notice that the fenders are just hacked. So this fault you can actually see when we build the Mighty Gentleman in episode 3 of Burnout. And this is the speedometer cable. In Volkswagens, both the buses and the Super Beetles and Beetles, they all go back to the front left tire. That's where the speedometer attaches to the car to actually measure how fast you're going. And so it essentially sticks through the front left tire in a way that it just rotates. Now, as seen in the episode, you can see that there's a safety pin that holds this in. Now, essentially, normally you'd put an R hook right through this hole where the safety pin goes through. However, this piece is the speedometer cable that I'm pushing in right now. And so it needs something to stop it from backing out and going through the tire. And naturally, we replaced it with a safety pin that would essentially do that trick. Does the safety pin rust? Yes. Are you supposed to use an R hook? Absolutely. But we stuck a safety pin in there so that I can see how fast I'm going. And what I can't show you right now because we're in the daylight, however, all of the dash lights on the dash actually light up except for the speedometer. And so when I'm driving at night, yeah, this thing works and it holds beautifully. However, the gauge is not lit up, so I can't truly see how fast I'm going. So next time you hop in your modern car and you think it's easy to drive kind of left to right, or you hit a bump and your car comes out of that bump straight, that has to do with your wheel alignment. And on this car, it is not aligned at all. And as a matter of fact, if I brought it to a shop to align it, they would probably tell me to get out of their shop because it's such a hassle to align one of these cars. And by that I mean, it's really not that hard. You actually have to tighten or loosen a couple arms that go across, or the sway arms, when you steer. However, it is so rusted and so old underneath this car because it's an old Volkswagen that they definitely wouldn't do it. So take a look at this car, I'll step back, and you can notice that it's truly just not aligned. The tires face slightly out on both sides. And so when I hit a groove in the pavement or hit a bump on the highway, and then I keep going, my car steers hard left or hard right, and it's undeterminable every single time until you hit the bump. And that's the same with braking. When you have a hard brake with someone in front of you, a modern car, you'll just stop just going straight. Where this, when you brake, because of the alignment, you steer hard to the right or hard to the left, depending on which way you are turning and how the alignment actually is. So take a good look at that, because car guys or car girls will notice that that alignment is messed up. For the glass in this car, it's not actually automotive glass. So automotive glass nowadays will be pretty much shatter in a way that it won't harm you as a driver or passenger. It's built for that and it's made for that. However, this glass is not. It's essentially old window glass. When I got the glass repaired, it was so bad that I had to bring it to a window shop to get them to install a pane of glass. And if you can look past this inspired sticker, you can notice that it's super thick. And so that glass is super uncommon nowadays. It's all thin stuff that, once again, when it shatters, it normally sticks together and saves the driver. Where this thing is just old, square, chunky, see-through material that somehow is allowed to be put on this car. Now for the wipers, I actually do check those for inspection, and they actually do work. However, I take them off the car because they're completely irrelevant to me, and when I get caught in the rain, I just stop driving. However, the wipers, when they're on, they go below the actual window, and so it just cuts up the blade whenever I turn on the wipers, exactly like my hand's doing. And that is essentially not only bad for the wipers, but looks brutal, sounds excruciating, and therefore I just take them off. It's as simple as that. Now on top of that, there's a switch inside. It's right here, and it goes one setting and it goes two settings. Now that's for the wiper blades. And on the one setting, it's the slow setting of the wipers. On the second setting, it's the fast setting. However, when you put it on the second setting, it blows the fuse entirely and you lose your wipers. And so I not only had to put a bigger fuse in there, but sometimes it just draws too much amperage where your headlights dim even more because the alternator can't keep up with the charging system. And so once again, you can't put the wipers on the second setting of the blades to go fast when I do have the wipers on to begin with, because it blows a fuse or it draws too much amperage. Now bear with me as we go towards the interior of the car, but there's a lot wrong with it. And I mean a lot. It's so bad that my friends get in this car and they say, this thing's roadworthy, and somehow I end up nodding. So anyways, the first thing wrong with it is the cup holders. Now, first of all, they don't work with skinny water bottles. They just don't. The water bottle just falls out, or it just gets in the way of the actual gas pedal that you need to press. But they're also not installed. Like, I bolted them together in the middle with a bolt, and I bought 2 cheap cup holders on Amazon, and then this just sits over the center column. But that's it. It's not actually bolted down. So a couple other things in the driver's vicinity that's wrong with this car, and although I did review the steering adapter, the actual part that adapts it to this brand new wooden steering wheel, the thing behind that is where the issue arises. This thing is a metal plate with multiple holes in it off of an electronic rack mount that I cut into a circle, buffed, grinded, and then spray painted black, drilled 6 holes into it, and then used it as an adapter on my steering wheel, not even knowing if it would hold the weight of the manual steering on this car. This thing is MacGyvered together. So as Tarpy likes to say, it fits the rest of the car perfectly. But it allows me to not even put on my brand new steering wheel straight. My steering wheel is crooked when the car goes straight. You can notice that the turn signal switch is actually on the wrong side of the column. And so every time you go to turn the signal, it's actually on the right. Now, you'll also notice that the key is on the left, which this key doesn't even start the car. It essentially just prevents it from steering straight only, because when you take the key out, it locks up steering wise. So if you're a true Volkswagen connoisseur, you'll notice that the column is just flipped upside down. This column is supposed to bolt up. And so therefore, the turn signal switch would be on the left and the key would be on the right, how you would normally start the car. However, I flipped it over because Tarpy MacGyvered me together a bed frame steering bracket that mounts to the fiberglass wall and holds in the entire steering shaft via the bottom. And so the steering column has to mount on the top and go down, hence why it's flipped. And the directional switch is wrong, the key switch is wrong. And the bracket, there's no real rules or directions on how to build it. So he put it together with bed frames using bolt and welding it together. Now during this nice cinematic shot of the bed frame bracket that Tarpy built, if you can look right in front of it, you can actually see the wiring is just dangling down. And so when I drive this car, it just hits my leg hairs, which is truly exhilarating. But on top of that, you'll notice that this green and black wire is conveniently labeled that it also goes to the pink one. So the wires aren't even the same color. And I believe this goes to, well, the right blinker. And that's why it's just dangling there, because at some point in time, I disconnected it. However, I haven't even taken the 5 minutes to zip tie these up. Instead, they just dangle down before I go for an inspection. Because this is fiberglass kit, the doors are fiberglass as well. And they're the number one things that rattle when you drive. And they rattle in and out from the car. And so therefore, they begin to crack. And fiberglass is one of those things that it doesn't just break, it cracks first. And so what you have to do is put fiberglass Bondo along the seams. And fiberglass Bondo is much different than metal Bondo. That's what you can see this off-green color from the door is. And it essentially runs all the way down the door along the seam, because that was all cracking whenever I drive the MG. And so slowly, I have to add more and more Bondo just to make sure the door doesn't split apart. Now I have two different trunk and hood latches, one of which is a pole from Home Depot that I kept the tag on in case you can return it 7 years later, and a broken hockey stick for the back. Check out this hood stand. This was made by Tarpy, and you can see that it's an old, essentially socket on the end. It's made for something like a lug nut. However, the shaft is perfect and has an amazing U-joint, so you can stick it right inside this metal pole and use it as a hood stand. Once again, perfect for the MG. And yes, we tried to weld it, but burned through on the welds, and it's held in by 2 screws that probably shouldn't be holding the amount of weight that they are. So on top of that, there's also stuff wrong in here. And I'm gonna start on the surface. There's a ton of wiring that is just thrown in here. And I don't just mean this is actually organized for the most part. I mean over here. And there is just so much excess wire sitting in that cab that if I broke down and somehow needed a jumper from here to here, I could just cut a chunk out of that and save somebody else or save myself on the side of the road. Is it a bad thing? Maybe not in that case, but it is way too much wiring to be sitting in front of the car. It's probably not good. I do have 2 sets of horns. These set right here actually involved a separate little air compressor that would shoot air through the horns. So they're actually much louder. However, I didn't want to take the time to install the wiring or the routing of the air lines to these horns. And instead, I just went out and bought 2 sousaphone looking ones that wind up and have their own little compressor inside them. And all you have to do is attach these 2 wires. And they're both different pitches. One's a low tone, one's a high tone. So could you hear them when I'm about to get into an accident? Absolutely not. But they pass an inspection. You'll notice my battery, not only is it the wrong battery, but it's held in by a super old strap that doesn't even ratchet. Once again, it's just wedged in there. You actually have to take the gas line off of the gas tank before you can pull the battery out if something ever happens. So not only when you put jumper cables on it, are you at risk of clipping one of those excess wires that have jammed in the bottom, but it's held in by a strap. I should probably fix that. Now the gas tank I put in this thing is an 8-gallon racing tank. Now that's a little excessive for this car as far as racing tanks, they are more expensive. However, it's the perfect size that fit in and fit under the hood. Because it's the perfect size, I only put it down with 2 bolts out of 4 because the front 2 bolts don't go to anything. So as you can see, right down here, there is a bolt that goes directly through the firewall of the car, which is beautiful. However, in the front, there's nothing that bolt can attach to. And so therefore, I only have it in by the back bolts. And underneath the gas tank, I felt as though I needed a gasket or something, some type of padding between the tank and the fiberglass. So naturally, I put a Boston Bruins rally towel, and it sits under the tank, collecting God knows what dirt every single time I use the car. There is another Burnout extra on me fixing my MG steering shaft, because we all know that snapped in half while I was driving the car. However, this steering shaft is truly an icon part of this car. Not only is it a U-joint in 2 different places, but it's actually off of a 2006 Volkswagen Jetta. And this is this piece right here. And that allows for different flexibility and, once again, the 2 different U-joints in the steering. However, on top of that, where it broke, I actually put in 2 separate bed frame chunks. And that's what's holding this in with all these booger welds so that it can be stronger at the weakest point of the steering. And so somehow that's all welded together so that the car can manually steer with a misaligned front end driving down the roads. So I mentioned that the key over here actually does nothing besides prevents the steering wheel from locking up when it's in the car. However, the key that actually starts the car does not start the car. Now I'm not going to tell you how. However, the key, when you plug it in and you turn it, the only thing that this key does is essentially charge the car. And so you can start and stop the car without this key. However, it would die eventually because the battery would go dead. The only thing this does is engage the generator in the back to charge the system. And so when this is on in the on position, the car will be charging and set to go. However, this key does not actually start the car. And this push button will only activate once this key's in. Insane stuff. I thought I was spectacular in 21st century when I installed this phone charger that is also a mount, and it charges your phone wirelessly. However, it's so weak that no matter what bump the MG hits, any phone just bounces out of the holder. And for anybody who's driven a manual car, that's tough to recover from. Now, continuing my notoriety of blasphemous wiring, you can also see that there's just chunks of wiring hanging down right here too. And somewhere in here is my hazard switch. So when I go to get inspected once again, I look under there somewhere for a hazard switch, hoping that it works and actually flashes all 4 lights, because God knows what's going on with all that wiring. So take a gander right down here by my feet, where you can see my DC shoes, which are currently wearing through on the soles of the shoes. However, the subwoofer actually gets in the way. So my foot right now hits the edge of the subwoofer. However, the pedal goes beyond it. And so sometimes the pedal will get stuck on the side of the sub because my shoe rubs right up against it. So what should I do? Probably install a bracket that holds the subwoofer individually away from the center column. Instead, what did I do? Shoved it with my hand in there because the rugs keep it secure enough, and every 1,000 miles it falls to the passenger seat floor. So naturally, from slamming the passenger door so much, the latch, like the door latch that you actually push down, came loose and broke. And so what did I do? I installed a house latch where it just goes up, over, and down. And so check this out. This is right inside the passenger door, and this is the only thing that holds the door in. And so to open it, you essentially just have to lift and go down, just like you would an ordinary latch. And that's how the door opens. But I also used mismatched nuts as washers because I didn't want to stick a bunch of washers in here, and this needed to be this far off the door. So instead of sticking this crap ton of washers, I essentially put in oversized nuts so that this is the perfect level to go directly and keep the door from opening. As if there weren't enough problems with the interior and the MG, the gas gauge is also an issue. Now see if you can follow this. When the car is off, the gauge is all the way to the left, meaning that the tank is empty, which is natural because the power is off. Now when you turn it on, the gauge goes all the way to full. However, that's on an empty tank. And so when you fill up the tank, it actually goes to half of a tank of gas on the gauge. So that means that the gas tank is full. And as you use that gas and you burn it in the engine, that gauge goes from half to full. And so therefore it works its way from on the gauge half towards the F. And once you get to that full mark, you know that you're low on gas, which is completely, utterly ridiculous. But somehow, once you know that, you can drive the MG and not run it out of gas. I mentioned in episode 3 that Tarpy and I were the ones who actually built these seats. The outside cover of the seats, like the actual stitched part that looks like leather, came with the Volkswagen kit. The foam underneath and the structural integrity of the seats did not. And so this wood that you can see right here, that actually came out of my 2006 Honda Ridgeline. Now when I bought my Ridgeline, the guy before me had this bed thing that had a handle on it. It was just a piece of plywood, and you could essentially pull the handle and access anything in the bed of the truck. It was essentially an easy out, if that's what you want to call it, to grab anything that was in the bed. I hated that, and I'm young enough to just jump up in the bed of the truck and grab whatever's in there. And so I cut up that piece of wood, and that's the exact piece of wood that's holding together the back and two bottom of the seats in this MG. Very resourceful. However, will it rot faster? Probably, and God knows what's been on top of that wood. Although the engine has proved to be one of the most reliable parts of this car, there's a few things back here that you would call janky. And number one thing is the OEM original gas line dangles there, and I don't use it. So right down here, this that my hand is on is the original gas line. However, it just dangles in there, and I don't have it hooked up to anything because I don't use it as a gas line. I have the gas routed through the tunnel and out the other side towards the engine because it's easier to attach to the carb. So for some reason, that's still there. However, I haven't seen where it attaches, so I just let it dangle. Now this right here is a stock 1974 Volkswagen Super Beetle engine. I believe it's a 1600cc. These things are small, 4-cylinder engines that surprisingly get pretty good gas mileage for the old condition that they are in. Mine is very noticeable because the coil was supposed to sit in this bolt and this bolt right here with this mounting plate. However, it sits too high. And so when you have the coil mounted, it's about here. However, when my cover comes down, it hits the coil when it comes down. And so what did I do? I just uninstalled that bracket for the coil. That arises issues because your coil gets really hot. And so I moved this bracket all the way down to the bottom of the coil just so that the coil wouldn't hit the exhaust manifold and heat up or overheat or burn through the coil, which could all cause issues. So naturally, my coil just kind of wiggles in there. However, the bracket's preventing it from doing anything dangerous. There's a bunch of different rust prevention methods that you can use underneath cars because especially in New England, they can rust up and get salt on them very easily. Now, one of the things I use is POR 15. It's essentially a rust prevention paint in liquid form that you just brush on with a paint. Now, before I knew anything about cars, I had bought this thing and it had been stripped down to the chassis. So one of the first things I did was painted the chassis underneath and the top with POR 15. What I didn't know was to not paint the exhaust pipes. And so naturally, not the tips because they were chrome. However, all of this I had painted black. All of the exhaust. Now, although this is a different exhaust than what came stock on the 74 Bugs, it's still a dual tip that matches up to the engine, but I had painted it all black. So my first roughly 100, 200 miles of driving this MG once it was running, there was additional smoke behind me, not because there was an old engine, not because I was burning oil, but because I painted the exhaust pipes and it was burning off the paint that I had previously put on. That is a rookie mistake. This part right here, you can see that there's a nice tan line, as they like to call it. And this is from the seatbelt hanging outside the door. However, when I'm driving the car, I never noticed that the seatbelt was hanging outside the door. So this was like this for probably 3 months last summer. And I was driving around, and hence why there's a tan line. The last thing after all this that's wrong with my MG, which is actually my personal favorite. And if you're a true car person, you'll understand what I'm talking about if you can follow this a little bit. But this is hacking stuff together, hardcore level. Now, the cable that runs from the positive side of your battery runs all the way to the starter, because that gets the most juice when you start the car. However, the cable I had wasn't long enough. And so naturally, I took, and I'm gonna use this as an example, but I took a cable, I cut it, I sprayed the copper inside, like sprayed it out, and then I essentially stuck a big bolt in the middle. And I took that copper wiring and wrapped it around the threads of the bolt. I then took electrical tape and electrical taped around that, so that the bolt, which was conductive, was used in the series of wiring, so I could then do that again on an additional cable that could go to the starter. And so right under here in the back tire, you'll notice that that's exactly what is shown. This right here is a red cable, and it goes into this electrical tape that has the bolt inside and has the copper sprayed around the bolt. Now out of that comes a black wire, which then goes to the starter. And that is not safe at all. What you should do is just get a different wire that's an extra 2 feet and install that in the first place, and never have done what I did. But instead, that one bolt has yet to fail me to this day on starting this car. Does it have issues elsewhere? Yes. But that bolt is perfect. And that's my favorite thing about the car. That was pretty fun. However, it's discouraging knowing that there are this many things wrong with the car, and any of those things could go wrong at any moment. But yes, that is everything wrong with my 1952 MG and everything that I put on this list. And as of now, I'm fixing none of it. But you can keep up to date on burnoutshow.com in the fleet section, as well as keeping up to date on YouTube videos by clicking the notification bell in the corner and seeing this car drive summer after summer and be on the roads, whether it's legal, safe, or efficient or not. You'll see me and Tarpy driving around in this thing. So that's all for this Burnout Extra. I hope you enjoyed. Leave comments down in the comments section. I love to hear about this car. I love to hear feedback and comments. I personally love driving it, and I promise you it's an eye catcher that will get more heads to turn than something like a Lamborghini. Once again, thanks for watching. Check us out on social media and be sure to subscribe. Thank you. If you're a true Volkswagen connoisseur,
I like it, do it, yeah.
And although some of them are attached like this one, which I believe goes to the right blinker,